everybody. I'm Tom Whitty from Upflex, and I'm so excited to be joined here this morning with Corinne Murray from our Strategic Advisory Council, who has graciously agreed to sit down with us and share her latest thoughts and wisdom on her work on all things future of work. And so, Corinne, thanks so much for joining us today. I'll turn it over to you to do a quick introduction for
Thank you.
folks that don't yet know you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Corinne Murray. I am founder of Agate, which is my small and mighty consultancy that focuses on future of work, workplace transformation, and organizational transformation. So the short version of that is basically I'm helping companies navigate change through developing new ways of working, developing new approaches to what workplace means, all in the name of how do we make work better for all of us. I partner with Work Time Revolution, which is a company that also does a lot of new ways of working, work time reduction. So identifying or partnering with companies to identify ways to reduce the number of hours that people are working per week for actually more productivity gains, even though it sounds ironic for knowledge workers, especially. It's a huge gain for organizations and individuals. And I am closing up a manuscript that will be coming out later this year that I'm co-authoring with a very dear friend in the workplace world.
Amazing. I know we've all been very eagerly anticipating that, and we'll look to have you back to sit down with us, of course, when that launches. But in the meantime, Corinne, again, there's so much going on right now. I think, it seems like the rate of change, if anything, has only accelerated over these last few months. And so let's start maybe like just really high level. What are you seeing are the biggest reasons that talent is really making moves, is motivated to join a workplace or not join a workplace? What is sort of emerging as sort of the common denominators of talent moves that you're seeing?
Yeah, so there's two, I would say it's a little bit of tale of two cities. There's the one version of I think there's a little bit of a sort of a reprise, a recall to the exhaustion and burnout that people were feeling in 2021 that led to the great reshuffle that we saw, where people were just hopping left and right. I don't think the conditions are nearly as optimal as they were then, but I do think that there's a similar level of burnout and exhaustion because of how choppy and how uncertain the past several years have felt, that people are looking for places that are more stable, places where they don't necessarily foresee series of layoffs coming and things like that. So I think there's a sort of a protectionist mindset around finding a role where you can just take a breather. You can do the work that you're responsible for and not need to worry about, the roof caving in 6 months later. How reliable that is, given how the markets are behaving, given how just, gestures broadly stuff is going on right now. I don't know. I hope for those people that are seeking those kinds of roles, they get that kind of stability, because I think a lot of people are really are very in need of that. So I think that that's one category. And then there's another category of people who are constructively restless. I'll call them, of like, they're restless because the places that they're at aren't actually good containers for change or adaptability. And I think that, there are a lot of companies that are kind of stuck in not being able to make change or internalize the change that's happening around all of us in a quick enough way that, teams can evolve and adapt what they're working on to meet the market, meet the demands and things like that. So I think that there's another group of people that are kind of, they're chomping at the bit and they are ready. And so they are seeking companies that have that kind of organizational agility, companies that are able to just see what's going on in the market and not feel, as much, because I don't want to say they're not feeling as much upheaval by the drastic change, and that can be found in a number of different ways. Like, it could just be that a company says, this is our really good, like, we know what we are doing. We know what we are working toward. And because that North Star is so locked in and so stable, the things that can iterate very quickly or with more ease is how it gets done. So if the what is really clear, the how, if the what and the why are clear, the how can be pretty loose and dynamic based on based on changing conditions. Another thing could be companies that have started to invest really heavily in upskilling. There's a lot of data that shows over the past few years the employee skills, the typical skills that employers are hiring for are aging out. About their half-life is much shorter than it's been in basically in working history. So because those skills don't have the longevity that they might have 5 years ago or 10 years ago, we don't really, we're still constantly figuring out what are the new skills that are needed. And some of that is individual, going out and seeking, but also organizations are scrambling to figure out how do they support that? How do they actually bring that learning and development back into their organizations? And so, a really sharp-eyed job prospector could be looking at those types of opportunities and trying to really see between the lines of where is their actual training that's happening, where is their evolution and learning opportunities, not just for them as an individual, but organizational learning opportunities. So that way it's not just you getting really deep on one thing, but it's a thing that shifts your entire team or the entire division and things like that. So it's not typical. Like the things that make employers attractive right now, I don't think that they are. I take that back. It's not that they're not typical. It's that it's a very different different set of things than what I think a lot of people are thinking. Like I think the mainstream thinks we want, the community and a dynamic workplace, all of which are still important, but the real nuts and bolts of what's going to actually let workers be successful are, all these things around job upskilling and organizational, adaptability and all these things that are about nimbleness and ability to move, because there is an assumption that like we're in a moment of high-paced movement. And so those are the characteristics that I think are what make organizations most attractive right now. Those are the beasts.
That's awesome. And I want to go back to how you started that, because as you were talking, it was really interesting. It's coming to mind and about how, yes, people nowadays, because of everything that's gone on, tons of layoffs over the last few years, they're a bit fearful, right? And they want that predictability. They want that stability in their role. I saw an article just the other day about how the concept of do your 2 years to jump and get a pay raise, like that's over, right? Yeah. And so we're going back in time quite a bit now to people looking for a role that they can be with for a longer period of time, and feel, just like you said, that if they do the work and they do a good job, they're going to be rewarded. They're going to have work to show up and do every day. What's really interesting, though, I thought, is how in the midst of that desire for predictability and stability, you note the concept of needing to be able to find an organization that's nimble and agile and adaptable enough to become stable. Right, because it's the ones, and the interplay of those two things is really interesting a bit.
Thank you for calling that out, because there's actually stability. Actually, I don't know if it's. I think about this a lot, like the difference between stability and stasis, and I can't quite decide which one it is that is most important. But like if we think about, sorry, we're going to go nerdy for a second. If we think about like homeostasis, we learned about it in biology in like junior high school. And that's basically like.
You just brought me way back. But
everyone's in a weird little science classroom. Like
I just had like a classroom flashback.
Some beakers are around. But, we learned about homeostasis of like, that's where things are at balance. But just because things are balanced doesn't mean that they're static. Like everything, stasis is this constant movement of smaller systems that all sort of work to balance out the scales of things. So I think it's figuring out what is that sort of midpoint of like, how do companies offer people the felt sense of stability that has not been around for a couple of years, at least, in a work experience lens, while also still keeping pace with the demand of things. And I don't think that there's a perfect answer. I don't think that there are many organizations. I think it's hard for people to find those roles of stability. So I don't want to. I appreciate and fully understand the desire for those kinds of roles. And also, I don't know how readily available they genuinely are, because it is such a moment of upheaval where organizations are just, they're still figuring out stasis for their operations and don't even have the bandwidth to fully extend that out to a workforce. And obviously, this is a very broad brushstroke of things. So there are plenty of companies that are working really hard and doing this from a people-centered way. And we will see more fits and starts, some good case studies and some bad case studies. But the whole effort of this is like really figuring out why it's so important to give a workforce that stability, and what is required to maintain organizational stasis. And that is that learning and that development and that agility, because we're in a moment of intense change. This isn't just affecting some industries or certain regions. This is a unilateral. Companies are trying to figure out how the technologies that are coming onto the market are going to affect how they do their business. And those are big existential questions.
I agree. And I'm curious what your thoughts on how much of that upheaval, how much of this ambiguity that companies are operating in right now while they try to figure things out, how much is that impacting a lot of what we're seeing in the news around companies trying to bring folks back, sort of go back to old models of how and where we work? Is that rooted in this uncertainty? Is that, or at least exacerbated by it potentially?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
I think they're related. I don't know if it is a direct correlation. One has caused the other, but I do think that the executive urge to have people back in physical spaces together with the kind of rigidity that they want is absolutely a response to the uncertainty that they don't know necessarily how work is getting done or what work is getting done within their organization. And most organizations struggle to really articulate that through data and through storytelling in a way that an executive who, for the most part, is not able to spend their time in the weeds getting to know it themselves. So there is a huge disconnect between what an executive knows and what an employee knows, and that message chain is not very strong. And there's also a level of like data literacy. How comfortable are people, not just executives, but people at large, unless they live in the data and work with the data, how comfortable are they reading it? And until there is a higher level of literacy around that disconnect is only going to get worse, because, an executive, again, is never going to spend the majority of their time on the ground like an anthropologist understanding what's going on in the workflows. And I think there's a little bit of insecurity around not knowing what's going on in the organization, insecurity about these unforeseen things that they would just rather have that crutch of like, I want you guys here for this, for all these reasons. It doesn't matter what you tell me about how successful you are doing this. This is about what I know. And secondly, which is, I think, more emotional, it's more nostalgic in that they built their social capital. They built their careers by having these experiences. And there's there's more disconnect and lack of understanding around how organizations can maintain the sort of internal capital and sort of like leadership development that they experienced when they were coming up. So I think that there's a little bit of, well, I did it this way, so you guys should do it this way. In addition to, there's just, it's whack-a-mole. And for them, it's a little bit, there's this piece of just, let me take one variable off of the plate. And this is, in their mind, the easiest one. don't agree, but that's my sense of where executives see that. And I'm sure there are plenty of others, but I would say those are two of the sort of common denominator trends. And many of them might not be able to even diagnose it in that particular way.
No, I understand exactly what you're talking about. And I think before we go on to the next topic, I want to go back to something, because I agree that there's this, it's very hard to understand what's happening. It's hard to distill the large quantities of data that we have. I think, I see so many solutions nowadays that are all about providing more data, providing more data. You talk to most people, they are drowning. They are drowning in data that they can't distill and synthesize and take action on. And so I'm curious, are you seeing any technologies? Are you seeing any improvement or anything interesting coming out that's helping on this front, that's helping make sense of this mosaic of data from around the enterprise that could make it easier for executives to understand, to take action? Or is it still just this vast ocean that we're all seemingly drowning?
Yeah, well, I mean, first, yes, I don't think like companies are drowning in data. They have so much data. They collect data on so much stuff, but don't know how to connect it, how to, what to make, like how to make sense of it, how to generate insights or actions or it's this like sort of calcification layer, like this heavy layer of like calcified information, rather than it being this sort of wellspring of here's the data, here's what it's telling us, here's what we, here's sort of like the light bulb of what it means. So like, what does it tell and what does it actually mean? Then following it up with the actions. And I don't know if that, I don't think I believe that is something that technology should be doing just yet. And I'm sure that there will be plenty of more tech advanced naysayers who will let me know just how wrong I am. However, I think that's where upskilling lives. I think, for now, maybe I'll be wrong in a year and a half or 6 months, depending, but let the tools collect the data. I think there are plenty of systems that can help with the synthesis of like putting it in the bar charts and, actually putting the data into a digestible format. But in terms of generating the insights, in terms of, creating the actions and sort of the life cycle of what you do with the information, that's kind of like what the utopian description of how employees are meant to be interacting with AI is supposed to look like, is that, there's the tools take over the collection and sort of like the cleaning, and then people are able to spend their time in the context and in the nuance. Is why, whenever ChatGPT came out, I think that was late 2022, and there were like a huge amount of pieces around like, this is why the humanities matter more than ever, because it's about nuanced and sort of, multi-directional thinking. I have a bachelor's degree in a humanities section, so I'm very proud to be like, yeah, it's kind of curve. But that, to me, that's where upskilling lives. That's where organizations can say, all right, we have tools that cover this, but this is the gap that we've actually never been that great at filling. And we need you to tell us what the data is saying. We have it on our bar charts and we have it in this, but what's it telling us? And now, what are the implications? What are the implications? Or like, those are the insights. Like, what are the ways that this information affects? What are the ripple effects across the organization? And then generating a set of action plans that improve the situation, expand the situation if it's good. Really, like that diagnosing and identifying what comes next is less about technology, and that's more about where the people belong. But I don't know if organizations are there yet, because we've sort of been like pushed to think like, well, let's just get tools to do that. We need, until we really know how data in an organization connects, Like that's the other thing, is all these systems do not mostly communicate with one another. So there's a lot of data that could be saying things that are contradictory. And how do we reconcile that? It's hard to trust a tool to do that until we as humans have at least done it ourselves first, just because we're not going to know. It's a point of validation.
You brought up, I think, a really great topic that is obviously near and dear to our hearts at Upflex. And that's about as people start to interact much more with AI tools, and that's going to become more the mainstay, particularly with the push into agentic AI. How do we then balance and ensure those human interactions are maintained, right? And so, of course, even in the midst of, bringing folks back in, a lot of the intent behind this is to, quote unquote, maintain human interaction and connection in a way that builds culture, belonging, productivity, et cetera. What's your perspective on sort of this balance where we're asking, folks to become more proficient, to upskill in AI tools so that these things can become part of just how we work.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we're also seeing this sort of parallel fight to maintain and improve our human interactions. So how are these things coming together?
So again, broad brushstrokes. I know that there are, I fully believe that there are companies that are, trying to do right by their people. I don't think that they are coming together, generally speaking. I think that the implementation or encouragement of using AI tools within organizations has been very disjointed in a couple of ways. The first being that there isn't any sort of outward employee-facing AI strategy. And so there's this huge gap between people who are curious and just tinkering and figuring things out on their own. And then there are people who, for whatever reason, whether it's mistrust, whether it's environmentally driven, whether it's ethics driven, like a whole bunch of very legitimate concerns, they're not touching it. And so there's this, huge huge gaps in readiness and ability to integrate. So let's say company ABC does not have an AI strategy, but there's pockets of people that are playing around with the tools, and then there are pockets of people that are just hard and fast, don't want anything to do about it. Let's say tomorrow they decide we're going to start implementing AI tools, but they're not actually going to implement any sort of learning and development or trainings on them, just like they're here. And so what then, that their AI strategy then has consequences. It's not just about a group of people being curious and exploratory and others being wary. There's now an operational deficiency that puts these people who, for whatever reason, have not been interested in exploring at a deficit that could disrupt whatever their version of stability was. And is that fair? I don't believe so, because someone, you can't just be punished for not being interested in something, all of a sudden it being mandated and then not being taught how to use the things. So I have some concern, I think that's a concern that's on my mind, especially when we were just talking about employees wanting stability and wanting ways to just not have every single, tectonic plate shifting under their feet. So I think that there's that. From an organizational level, there are a lot of companies that are pushing AI, but not necessarily doing the trainings and doing the upskilling to make sure that what they're investing in is getting the best ROI. And then secondly, there's this AI study that came out a couple of weeks ago, the Writer AI paper, and it's executive survey, and more than 50% of executives said that they believe, millennials and Gen Z are actively sabotaging their AI strategies, which in some ways I kind of take with a grain of salt, because it feels a little bit like a continuation of, the post return to office era of we're the ones that are, millennials have been ungrateful for everything according to older generations since 2008. Gen Z has just been following in our footsteps. But that aside, I take it with a grain of salt, because maybe some are, maybe there are people that are sabotaging in like a very Luddite kind of way, because there isn't clarity around how they as employees are not going to be victims of the tools that are being implemented. So, what we were saying before, if tools are taking over the low level data, data capture, data analysis, data synthesis, and there's only going to be people who are doing the more sophisticated insights and actions and more strategic evaluation of data and how it fits within an organization. That means that entry level responsibilities then get like elevated again. In theory, that's not bad, but if there's no L&D to pair with that, then that does mean that there's that's a deficit for people, that for younger employees. So in that regard, I don't blame people for being saboteurs if they truly are acting in that kind of way, because most organizations are not really doing a great job of clearly expressing what the AI journey is outside of implementing these new tools into their business operations. They're not saying, they're not really articulating the cause and effect. And so that's only continuing this mistrust of organizations and fear of layoffs and this kind of, why am I going to learn these things that are ultimately going to replace me? It's a pessimistic view, but I don't think that people are necessarily wrong for having it, because there's not a lot of information that proves that they're wrong. So I have compassion for these people who are sabotaging. There's also, again, the ethics or the environmental arguments of like, I don't like the idea that I'm contributing to these things that are, so massive. And again, there's no, like, we're still at such early ages of understanding the consequences. Well, maybe that's not true. There have been plenty of AI ethicists and researchers who focus on this for years and have been warning us, but it's becoming more and more mainstream about having questions about the ethics and broader consequences of AI. So those are, I think, very fair pieces of resistance that organizations are not doing a great job at addressing head on. And because they're not addressing it head on, that gap and that mistrust is only growing. So yeah, I think those are some big glaring things that are getting in the way of people even being neutrally curious about things. Because it's either you are, an acolyte and into it, or you figured out how to make it worth your while, or you are just like, this is a big black box that I don't want to touch because I don't actually know what's in it. And I don't know if I'm safe if I go in there. And it's organizations are acting in a very short-sighted manner, because the data has been showing us that we are in the very messy part of jobs being tasks and jobs collapsing into tool responsibilities rather than people responsibilities. And there hasn't been a lot of job redevelopment or skill repositioning to create clear paths that navigate people through this. And I think we're going to be in this really sticky point until organizations start to realize that their AI strategy isn't just about implementing the tools and finding the efficiencies. It's about integrating these tools into how your people work. And you can't do it without your people, because like I said, like, your people are the complexity and the nuance layer.
I agree entirely. And I want to go back to one point that you made that really stuck out for me a moment ago, which was that as the tools and the AI start to take over those lower level entry type tasks and responsibilities, it's raising the bar for what that entry level responsibility or proficiency is for folks. Mm-hmm. But without the requisite L&D or upskilling motion or reskilling motion to accompany it. And so as hybrid work has become the mainstay model and probably will continue to be for the foreseeable future, how do you think about those strategies now needing to adapt even further to accommodate the fact that the work week is changing, where we work is changing, that all of this is very fluid, meaning who I come in with and when and where may change throughout the course of the year based on my needs and collaboration patterns. And so we have to almost reimagine, how do we connect and how do we reach these folks and how do we get them that education and development and enablement that they need to bring them up to sort of the new level. But what does that look like in this hybrid environment though?
So geography aside, so putting like, where being physically co-located with people to the side for a second, part of why, hybrid as it was designed, post COVID or post, great work from home experiment, seeing as COVID's still here. But it didn't work because everyone was on different schedules. And I think the organizational concern of like, we have these newcomers and we're just kind of letting them loose without having mentorship or shadowing opportunities. I think that's very real. However, the people who these, newer employees, whether they're fresh out of college or they shifted industries or, whatever, the people they're supposed to be shadowing are in back-to-back meetings and, barely scraping by on getting their individual work done. And so to then add on mentorship and shadowing to that, it's none of it is compatible. And so none of this gets better until organizations actually take the steps to improve their ways to evaluate and really audit their ways of working, to make sure that they're spending their time in quality ways. And so quality can be measured in a bunch of different ways, of like quality for the business, quality for, quality for your team building and for onboarding. Like there are ways to gather all these metrics. And I can guarantee that back-to-back meetings are not the way, but it's, those are the behaviors that have been so ingrained in us. I mean, that level of intensity of back-to-back meetings is relatively new. Like that really came into play in 2020 because we were used to just being able to walk up to one another. And so the next proxy was scheduling meetings. These are behaviors that need evolving because they're still relying on us being synchronous, doing stuff at the same time together. That's this experience is still valuable, but we have to be more selective about when we use it and why we use it. Not because it's unimportant, but because the guardrails are pretty lax on when we use meetings, which takes away from individual focus time, which takes away from mentorship or shadowing opportunities, and other essential pieces of how work gets done. So I think, even though it doesn't have much to do with AI specifically, or just any sort of tech that's been coming out lately, most organizations still don't have a concept of how their people spend their times or why they're spending their time in this particular way. And until we do that, work is just going to be what it is with more stuff slapped on top. And we need to really sort of crack the nut and look at the insides and evaluate, like, based on the tools and the resources we have, what's the best way to do this type of work? Is it still synchronous? Is it in person, or can it be done distributedly? Is it, if we say that people need X amount of time doing individual focus work, let's validate, is that the right amount of individual focus work that people should be doing, or should we be distributing it to other teams? And these are really essential questions, because what this is meant to do is make sure that you are spending your time well. Dave Norton, who was part, and Joe Pine came up with the time well spent model, and it's written about in the book, I think, Experience Economy. But the idea is basically like how you're breaking your time down. So it's time well spent and a couple of others, just to make sure you're like, someone can answer like, yes, this was the right way for me to spend my time doing activity X. And doing that at an organizational level of like, these are the organizational standards, and here's the way that you as an individual can variate how you do it, just creates that. I mean, that's something that creates stability. It might not look the way that most organizations want it to, but it is a point of stability that, people can respond to, and people are at least reading from the same song sheet because a song sheet exists. And then, so there's that, and that's just the behaviors. And then with hybrid, figuring out what days, like what type of time we are actually spending in person together. That gets to be so much more interesting because you now have a rubric for what's the best way to get these types of work activities done. And so you then get to decide, okay, because we have, because we need to go through like big room planning for, for like our budget or like the work we want to do for 2026, that's an intensive exercise. So that actually is something that is best, the time well spent on that would be in person, probably doing a workshop over the course of 1 or 2 days. We get some team building in there, the timeline gets compressed, all that kind of stuff. And the other piece too then becomes, if companies want particular days, not just teams doing particular types of work, if companies say like, we do value in-person time, and, because we know that people are spending the best time that they can working on all these things, we're actually going to say that, time well spent for the organization and for our culture is to have culture days once a month. And part of that will be company-wide programming, and part of that will be learning and development for your particular groups. And divisions can do this on their own for more specialized trainings and things like that. So we can't have that kind of sophisticated curation of like on-site days until we start to get rid of the pressures people feel around how work is getting done now. And I think that's something that companies are having a hard time getting around because one, it's disruptive. So like, from a practical standpoint, I understand it, even though it's short-sighted. And I don't think that there's a full understanding of just how much burden the average worker is feeling. And so adding more stuff is not going to help. And so, first it needs to be the audit, evaluation, and sort of like transformation of the basic, very unsexy stuff of like, how do we collaborate? How do we focus? How do we gather? Like all these very basic sort of like DNA level things. I'm in a very science mood apparently today. And then after we have a really sound strategy around how we do these things and what's the sort of scale of interpretation, what are the boundaries that people and teams can interpret within, then we can start to say like, great, we have our core competencies, and now we want to use the time back in ways that are going to pay things forward, so learning, so culture, like all these things that companies care about, but don't operationally have a way of demonstrating it.
Amazing. Well, I'm sure we could continue this conversation for hours longer, but I know that we both got to get going with the week. So Corinne, we're going to leave it there for now. Been an amazing discussion. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and the latest on all of your interactions with, I know, the amazing customers that you work with day in, day out. We're looking forward to sitting down again, hopefully in the next few weeks, once your project is launched. Thanks so much for joining us today, though. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a good one.